Millionaire comes home unannounced, and freezes at what the new nanny did with his son. Daniel Morgan had never run so fast in his life. The taxi had barely stopped in front of the luxury high-rise in Upper Manhattan when he practically jumped out, tossing a handful of bills to the driver without even checking the amount. His business trip to Boston had ended earlier than expected, and in that instant, only one thought consumed him: go home, see Ethan. It had been a week since Daniel last held his son. 7 days might not seem long for a man buried in work, but for a father clinging desperately to the fragments of his broken heart, it felt like an eternity. 2 years ago, a car accident had taken Emma, his wife, and left Ethan as the only fragile thread binding Daniel to this world. And now, Ethan's leukemia threatened to cut that thread completely. Daniel strode into the lobby, his shoes striking firmly against the gleaming marble floor. The doorman greeted him, but Daniel merely nodded and hurried. His heart pounded, not just from the hurried pace, but from the storm of emotions swelling at the thought of seeing Ethan smile again. He wanted to surprise his son, to watch those bright blue eyes light up with joy. Each step echoed, matching the rhythm of his racing pulse. When he stopped in front of the heavy wooden door, he froze. From inside, he heard laughter, Ethan's laughter, but mingled with it was another sound, a woman's voice, warm and melodic, one he had never heard before. He leaned closer, listening. The laughter continued, rich and unrestrained, ringing through the otherwise silent hallway. In that moment, Daniel's chest tightened. How long had it been since he'd heard Ethan laugh like that? Since Emma's death, and through the endless months of treatments, such laughter had become rare, as precious as gold. He drew a deep breath, excitement and dread tangling within him. He wanted to burst in, scoop Ethan into his arms, but another part of him wanted to savor this moment, to let his son's joy wash over him from a distance. Deep inside, he hoped that when he opened the door, he wouldn't just see his frail child, but a spark of hope, something he himself had lost long ago. Daniel's hand gripped the doorknob, trembling slightly. Part of him feared that stepping inside would shatter the fragile laughter. But another voice urged him forward. This was the moment. Slowly, he turned the handle, his heart locked in his chest. Daniel turned the doorknob slowly, hoping to slip inside without breaking the sweetness of the moment within. But within seconds, the sight before him dragged him into an emotional free fall. Inside the room, decorated with superhero posters, Ethan sat on his bed, wearing his familiar blue Superman t-shirt. In front of him stood Claire Bennett, the young woman who had only recently begun working in their home. But what she was doing made Daniel freeze in disbelief. Claire wore the simple uniform of a caregiver, a light blue dress with a white apron. In her hands was an electric clipper. Yet instead of using it on Ethan, Claire was shaving her own long brown hair. Locks fell to the floor, pooling around her feet like petals sacrificed for a higher cause. Ethan watched her with shining eyes, cheeks flushed with excitement, his small hands clapping eagerly. "There we go, my little Superman soldier," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. She ran a hand across her freshly shaven scalp and broke into a wide smile. "Now we truly look the same." Ethan burst into laughter, bright and unrestrained. The sound filled the room, pure and radiant, and Daniel realized he hadn't heard his son laugh like that in months. The boy clapped with delight, his eyes sparkling as if galaxies danced within them. "Miss Claire, you're amazing. Now you're a superhero just like me." Claire knelt down in front of Ethan, gently holding his tiny hands. "No, Ethan, you're the real superhero here. I'm just your special assistant." Daniel stood frozen at the doorway, his suitcase slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. His heart shattered and mended all at once. Who was this woman? Why would she do something so drastic for his child? In just 3 weeks, how had she become such an anchor in Ethan's fragile world? He tried to hold it back, but tears streamed freely. For 8 long months since Ethan's diagnosis, Daniel had seen countless sympathetic glances, perfunctory reassurances from doctors, nurses, relatives. Yet never had anyone made such a bold, spontaneous gesture overflowing with love. Claire suddenly turned, perhaps sensing his presence. Her deep green eyes locked with his. For an instant that stretched into eternity, Daniel saw gentleness, strength, and a hidden sorrow reflected there. But what struck him most was not embarrassment at being caught, nor fear of his reaction. It was the tender smile on her lips and the solitary tear tracing down her cheek. Daniel could hardly breathe. In that moment, he no longer saw an ordinary caregiver. He saw a miracle standing in the very room where his son had been fighting for hope. It took Daniel several seconds to find his voice again. He stepped inside, his feet heavy, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just sacrificed her hair before his son. Why? It was all he could manage, his voice hoarse. Claire slowly rose to her feet. Though she kept a gentle smile, her cheeks flushed pink, and her fingers tightened around the now silent clipper. She lowered her gaze for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Mr. Morgan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I first walked into this house, I saw a sadness in Ethan that pierced me to the core. I recognized it because I knew it myself. The feeling of being stared at with pity, of being set apart because you look different. I knew it because I had lived it." Daniel's brow furrowed, but his eyes softened. Claire drew a deep breath. "I had a younger brother, Michael. He was diagnosed with leukemia when he was just 17. Our parents were gone by then, so I became his primary caregiver. I spent nights in the hospital with him, surrounded by the smell of medicine and the hum of machines. I watched his hair fall out in clumps. And one day, I shaved my own head so he wouldn't have to feel alone." The story spilled into the room, pulling Daniel into a world he had never imagined. Claire lifted her eyes to his, the green depths veiled with old sorrow. "Michael passed away after 2 years of fighting, but I never forgot his smile when he saw me look just like him. Not a sick, isolated boy anymore, but part of a pair. When I look at Ethan, I see Michael again, and I can't stand by and watch this child carry a weight no child should ever bear." Daniel listened, his heart aching with every word. Suddenly, every gesture, every word of Claire's carried new meaning. She was no longer just a temporary caregiver, but a soul marked by loss, carrying her old scars to shield his son. He stepped closer, quietly. "But why shave your hair? There are other ways you could have shown support." Claire gave a faint smile, her eyes shimmering with tears. "You don't understand. Ethan doesn't need another person telling him, 'You're strong,' or 'It'll be fine.' He needs to look at someone and see that different doesn't mean shame, that a bald head isn't weakness. It's a superpower. If I can help him feel less alone, even just a little, then giving up my hair means nothing." Silence filled the room. Daniel felt something inside his chest break apart, and then, almost immediately, warmth seeped in. He had never met anyone willing to make such a simple yet powerful gesture. He looked at Claire for a long time, and for the first time in many dark months, Daniel felt the faint glimmer of hope. After Claire's story, the room sank into silence. Daniel stood there, conflicted, torn between admiration and confusion. He had never imagined a stranger could understand and reach into his son's world so quickly. Claire gently released Ethan's hands and stepped back a little. She looked directly at Daniel, her tone more serious now. "Mr. Morgan, there's something I need to tell you. Ethan doesn't look like the children I've seen in the final stages of leukemia." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire took a deep breath. For the past 3 weeks, I've observed every detail. Ethan runs more than I expected. He climbs stairs without resting. His reflexes are sharp, his coordination strong. His skin has color, his eyes shine. I don't see the signs I once knew, unexplained bruises, bleeding gums, or exhaustion so deep it crushes you. I saw all of that with my brother, but not with Ethan. Daniel stayed silent, his fists clenching. He remembered recent days. Yes, Ethan still laughed, still tried to play when he thought no one was watching. But Daniel had always assumed it was his son's last joy, a flicker before the storm. "You're telling me my son isn't as sick as the doctors say?" His voice trembled. Claire nodded slowly. "I can't claim certainty, but I believe there's either a mistake or something missing. Ethan may not be in the critical state you've been told. What matters is getting a second opinion from a completely independent doctor." Daniel let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Do you know how many doctors I've seen? Over 15 specialists. Every one of them said the same thing: terminal stage." "And you believe them because they're doctors," Claire replied softly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not saying they're all wrong, but I know what a child's body looks like when it's shutting down. Ethan doesn't look like that. Mr. Morgan, if there's even the smallest chance the truth is different, shouldn't we take it?" Daniel glanced at his son. Ethan was now happily scribbling in a notebook, his bald head gleaming under the light. He giggled to himself, blissfully unaware of the heavy conversation unfolding around him. Daniel's chest tightened. He feared hope. He feared that if he opened the door to it, he would only lose everything again. Yet Claire's words echoed in his mind. If there's even the smallest chance. He exhaled deeply, his voice low. "What do you want me to do?" Claire stepped forward. "Let me arrange it. I know a reputable hospital where the test results won't be influenced by those who've managed Ethan's case before. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing. But if I'm right, Ethan could have an entirely different future." Daniel studied her for a long moment. In Claire's green eyes, he saw not only compassion, but the fierce determination of someone who had endured loss and sworn never to let it happen again. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, we'll try. But God help me if I let Ethan hope and watch him fall again. I don't know if I can survive it." Claire answered softly, but with certainty. "You won't have to." 2 days later, Daniel and Claire took Ethan to St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Boston. It was the place Claire trusted most, renowned for its independent staff and rigorous testing standards. On the way there, Daniel barely spoke, his eyes fixed on the window, his hands clenched tight on the armrest. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in the back seat, cheerfully telling Claire about his favorite superheroes. In the waiting room, when the nurse called his name, Claire squeezed Ethan's hand and whispered, "Think of this as an adventure, just like in your comics." Ethan nodded eagerly, his eyes shining, while Daniel gave only a faint nod, unable to speak. The blood test was performed quickly. Ethan held Claire's hand the entire time, as if she were his shield. Once the samples were taken away for analysis, all they could do was wait. The minutes crawled by, suffocating. Daniel checked his watch over and over, while Claire kept her gaze on Ethan, watching every breath. At last, the attending physician entered, holding the results. He invited them into his office. Daniel's head spun, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Ethan's results," the doctor began, then looked up at them. "Not only is he not in a terminal stage, but in fact, his current markers indicate complete remission. There are no signs of progressing leukemia." Daniel went numb. A buzzing filled his ears. He collapsed into the chair, his hands covering his face as tears spilled freely. Beside him, Ethan tilted his head, puzzled. "Dad, why are you crying? I'm fine." Claire squeezed the boy's hand tightly, smiling through her tears. "Yes, Ethan, you're healthier than we ever imagined." But the joy lasted only a moment before a crushing question slammed into Daniel's mind. If Ethan was in remission, then why had he been told for months that his son was dying? The next day, Daniel requested copies of the results from the laboratory Dr. Richard Hale had always used. When he compared them, the difference was staggering. The lab tied to Dr. Hale reported abnormal white blood counts, evidence of disease progression, treatment ineffective. In stark contrast, the St. Mary's report read, normal markers, no malignant cells detected, patient in remission. Daniel's body went weak. If one was true, the other was a lie. And if it was a lie, it wasn't a small mistake. It was deliberate. Claire placed the reports side by side, her voice low but her eyes blazing. Ethan has been healthy for some time, and someone chose to hide that from you. Daniel stared at her, fury and fragile hope rising in his chest. You're suggesting my son's doctor falsified the results? Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she told him about whispers she'd heard in the nursing world, of physicians who exploited patients, prolonging treatments for profit. Richard Hale was not an unfamiliar name. People had murmured, but no one had dared to challenge him openly. We need more evidence, Claire said firmly. But the truth is, right here in front of us, Ethan is well, and someone made you believe the opposite. Daniel gasped, his hands trembling as he clutched the papers. In that moment, his fear of losing his son began to give way to something new, the fierce drive to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, the test reports spread across the desk, the lamp casting long shadows over the pages like silent accusations. He remembered every appointment with Dr. Richard Hale, every sympathetic glance, every firm statement that Ethan had only months left. Now all of it seemed like a cruel performance. Claire entered quietly, carrying a cup of tea. She placed it gently before him and sat across the desk. I've contacted someone, she said. Dr. Laura Mitchell. She was my professor when I studied nursing. Now she works in the Medical Oversight Board at St. Mary's. If anyone can help us expose the truth, it's her. The next day, they met Laura in a small office at the hospital. A woman in her 50s, silver streaks in her hair, sharp yet kind eyes. After hearing Claire's explanation, Laura remained silent for a long moment before saying, The name Richard Hale isn't unfamiliar to us. There have been suspicions for years, but concrete evidence has always been lacking. He owns his own laboratory, and he insists on using his staff for home blood collections. That opens the door for manipulation. Daniel leaned forward. You mean he could have tampered with Ethan's results? Laura nodded. It's entirely possible. There have been scattered reports from families, but no one dares to sue. They fear that challenging him might cost their children treatment, or they simply don't have the strength to confront the wealth and power he wields. Daniel clenched his fists, blood boiling at the thought of all the months Ethan had endured toxic treatments, needles, suffering, just to feed one man's greed in a doctor's coat. Claire laid a hand on his shoulder, grounding his rage before it spiraled into despair. What we need now is clear evidence, not just to save Ethan, but to stop him from hurting other children. Laura handed them a thin file. Here's a list of cases I find suspicious. Some of these children have passed away, others are still under treatment. If you want to go further, we'll need to reach out to these families and encourage them to speak up. On the drive back, Daniel was silent at the wheel, while Claire held the file tightly against her chest. The papers felt as heavy as the world itself. When they arrived home, Daniel collapsed into a chair, his eyes burning red. I trusted him. I put my son's life in his hands. And now? His voice broke, unable to continue. Claire sat beside him. You're not at fault. He preyed on your trust. But now we have a chance to turn this around. We're not just fighting for Ethan, we're fighting for every other family." Daniel lifted his gaze to her. In Claire's eyes he saw something that steadied him, a flame, forged from past pain but burning with strength. For the first time, Daniel felt he was no longer alone in this battle. He drew a deep breath, gripping Claire's hand tightly. "All right, let's find the truth. Wherever it is, I'll follow it to the end." News that Daniel had taken Ethan to St. Mary's didn't take long to reach Dr. Richard Hale. One morning, as Daniel was preparing breakfast for his son, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed Dr. Hale. Daniel picked up, his voice carefully steady. "Mr. Morgan," the doctor's voice came through, colder than his usual friendly tone. "I hear you took Ethan to another hospital. Do you realize how dangerous that is for a terminal patient?" Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "You're wrong. Ethan is not terminal. He's in remission, and I have proof." There was silence on the other end. Then Dr. Hale lowered his voice, laced with threat. "You're making a serious mistake. If you continue to defy me, I'll have no choice but to contact Child Protective Services. I'll report that you're denying your son necessary treatment." Daniel clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You will never lay a hand on my son again. I've transferred Ethan's case to St. Mary's. From now on, you have no authority over us." He hung up decisively, though rage still burned in his chest. Claire entered, noticing his trembling hand. He told her everything. She didn't flinch, only nodded. "I expected this. He won't let go easily, but we won't be alone in this fight." That afternoon, the doorbell rang. 2 plainclothesmen stood outside, flashing IDs. "We're investigators from Child Protective Services," one said. "We received a report that Ethan Morgan may be denied necessary treatment by his father." Daniel froze, but Claire quickly invited them in. Ethan came bounding from the living room, hands covered in paint, his face glowing. Look, I just finished my new superhero drawing." The investigators glanced from the boy to Daniel. He handed them the test results from St. Mary's, along with Dr. Emily Carter's report confirming Ethan was in remission. As they read, Ethan continued darting around the room, energetic and strong. One of the men couldn't help but chuckle. "This child looks healthier than both of us." At last, they returned the papers, their expressions softened. "Mr. Morgan, this seems to be a serious misunderstanding. We'll file our report and escalate the matter. And if what you say is true, the one who should be investigated isn't you, it's your son's former doctor." When the door closed, Daniel collapsed into a chair, cold sweat dampening his forehead. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "This is only the beginning. But you see, we're no longer alone." Daniel looked at his son, racing around with a paint-smeared drawing. For the first time in months, he truly smiled. 2 days after the Child Protective Services incident, Claire returned home with unexpected guests. When Daniel opened the door, he saw 2 women standing there. Claire introduced them. "This is Karen Blake and Melissa Turner. Their children were also treated by Dr. Hale." Karen, thin and weary, clutched an old handbag, her eyes red and swollen. Melissa held the hand of her young son, a boy about 10 years old who looked far healthier than Daniel imagined a leukemia patient would. They gathered in the living room. The air was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock. At last Karen spoke, her voice trembling. "My daughter Lily. She went through chemotherapy for a whole year. Every time I asked Dr. Hale, he said her cancer hadn't gone into remission. But when I took her to another hospital, they told me she'd been cancer-free for 8 months. I let my child suffer 8 months of pain because I trusted him." Melissa continued, anger lacing her tone. "My son, Jacob too. He was injected, pumped with drugs until he was exhausted. Hale said it was preventive treatment." But another doctor confirmed it was completely unnecessary. We were deceived. Daniel's hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Claire placed the file Laura had given them on the table. Faces, stories, all coming together into a horrifying picture. Not just Ethan, but dozens of children had been victims. Karen pulled a stack of papers from her bag. Bills, prescriptions, lab results. Each one was living evidence of abuse. "We don't want to stay silent anymore," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "If you and Claire are willing, we can bring the truth to light together." Daniel looked at Claire. Her eyes shone with determination. He turned back to the two mothers and nodded firmly. "We'll do it, not just for my son, but for every child robbed of their childhood." Ethan and Lily, Karen's daughter, ran in from the backyard with a ball in their hands. "Dad, Miss Claire, Miss Melissa, watch us score this goal." Ethan laughed, his bald head gleaming in the afternoon sun. Lily laughed with him, her eyes glowing after months of hardship. The sight made Daniel's throat tighten. These children should have been playing and running, not confined to hospital rooms and poisoned with chemicals. Now they laughed, free and strong, the clearest proof of the truth Hale had tried to bury. Claire laid her hand on the stack of papers. "This is the time. We'll gather every piece of evidence, reach out to the other families, and prepare to confront him. He can't go on any longer." Daniel looked around the room, faces weary but burning with resolve. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just fighting for Ethan. He was standing with an army of parents who had chosen not to be afraid anymore. Within a week of the meeting with Karen and Melissa, the truth began to spill out. A journalist from a major New York newspaper, an acquaintance of Daniel's from past architecture projects, received the documents and launched an investigation. The first article appeared with the headline, "Renowned pediatric oncologist accused of prolonging childhood cancer treatments for profit." Overnight, the story exploded. TV stations invited experts to comment, social media erupted, and dozens of parents shared their own stories. The number of families suspecting they had been victims of Dr. Hale skyrocketed, soon surpassing 30 cases. Daniel watched the news from the living room. Ethan sat beside him, giggling with Lily as they built a pillow fort. The sight of those healthy, laughing children contrasted sharply with the captions scrolling across the screen. "Unnecessary injections. Patients died from wrongful treatments. Millions in illicit profits." Claire entered, her phone buzzing nonstop in her hand. "Other families are reaching out. They want to join a class action lawsuit. Dr. Mitchell has also agreed to testify." Daniel nodded, eyes burning with resolve. This is the time he pays. Soon after, the police launched a formal investigation. One early morning, before the sun had even risen, breaking news hit every channel. Dr. Richard Hale arrested at his home. Cameras captured him covering his face against a storm of reporters' questions. But the most shocking revelation wasn't just falsified lab results. When authorities searched his private lab, they discovered Hale had also been embezzling chemotherapy drugs, selling them on the black market, while real pediatric patients in need were given expired or diluted medicine. The news shook the nation. Parents raged. Medical organizations called for reform. Inside Daniel's home, the tension slowly gave way to newfound belief. One evening, while watching the news, Ethan suddenly turned to ask, "Dad, does this mean I don't have to do chemo anymore?" Daniel pulled his son into his arms, whispering, "No, Ethan, you're free now, and you'll never have to go through that again." Claire watched father and son, her eyes glistening. She knew the legal battle was far from over, but this moment was their first true victory, the triumph of truth over darkness. The media storm had not yet settled, but inside Daniel's home, the atmosphere was entirely different. Ethan, once a child living in fear of illness, was now eagerly making a list of things he wanted to do. "Dad, I want to go back to school. I want to play soccer, and I want a big birthday party," Ethan said, his eyes shining brightly. Daniel laughed and pulled his son into his arms. "You'll have all of that. You'll get to be a normal kid, Ethan." One afternoon, Karen brought her daughter Lily to Daniel's house. In the little girl's hand was a small suitcase. Karen sat on the couch, her voice breaking. "Daniel, Claire, I know this is a huge thing to ask, but I can't care for Lily the way she needs anymore. After everything that happened, I still live with crushing guilt, and I fear I'm not strong enough for her. But I see how happy she is here, with Ethan, with both of you. If you're willing, please give her a new home." Daniel was stunned, while Claire quickly took Karen's hand. "You've done everything you could, but if you trust us, we'll love Lily as our own." By then, Lily had already run to Ethan. The two laughed loudly, tossing a ball back and forth across the living room. Ethan shouted, "Lily, it'd be awesome if you were really my sister." The little girl stopped, looked at Karen, then turned to Daniel and Claire, nodding softly. "I want to stay here." Karen broke down in tears, hugging her daughter one last time before leaving. Daniel stood beside Claire, his hand finding hers. In that moment, they both knew. Their family had changed forever. That night, after tucking the two children into bed, Daniel and Claire sat together in the living room. The warm light cast a gentle glow, wrapping the silence in peace. Daniel turned to her, his eyes full of emotion. "Claire, I've been thinking. I'm not just grateful for what you did for Ethan, but for bringing hope back into this home. I want us to be a real family. Will you say yes?" Claire froze, tears streaming down her face. She smiled, whispering softly, "Yes, Daniel, I will." 6 months later, Daniel's home buzzed with joy like never before. The garden was decorated with white and blue ribbons, balloons swaying gently in the breeze. Today was a special day, Daniel and Claire's wedding, and also the anniversary of Ethan's remission. Guests filled the place, neighbors, friends, and families who had once been victims of Dr. Hale. Children ran across the yard, laughing as if hospitals and pain had never existed. Ethan and Lily held a special role, ring bearer and flower girl, proudly carrying the wedding rings with wide smiles. When the music began, Claire walked toward Daniel. She wore a simple white dress, her hair just beginning to grow back after she shaved it. But the simplicity only made her glow brighter than anything Daniel had ever seen. The officiant asked, "Daniel Morgan, do you take Claire Bennett to be your wife, to walk with her through every trial and joy from this day forward?" Daniel looked into Claire's eyes, his voice trembling with emotion. "I do. Not only as my wife, but as the woman who saved my son when I was broken, the woman who brought hope back into our home, and the love I thought I'd never find again." Then it was Claire's turn. She gripped his hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And I do as well. I take you, the man who gave me the chance to be a mother again, the man who stood with me to fight for truth, and the man who taught me that love can heal every wound." When they kissed, the garden erupted in cheers and applause. Ethan and Lily jumped up and down, shouting, "Yay! Yay!" After the ceremony, Dr. Emily Carter came to congratulate them. She shared the news. "Doctor, Hale had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, permanently stripped of his medical license, and ordered to pay millions in restitution to the families. More importantly, a new law had been passed. Every pediatric cancer diagnosis now required a mandatory second opinion, and all laboratories had to undergo dual certification." Daniel squeezed Claire's hand, their eyes meeting in certainty. Their fight had not only saved Ethan, but also changed the system. And today, surrounded by children's laughter and golden sunlight, they began a new journey together, the journey of a complete family. That night, after the wedding and a reception filled with laughter, the house grew quiet again. Ethan and Lily had fallen fast asleep on the sofa, still in their formal clothes, clutching each other as if afraid to let go. Daniel and Claire sat nearby, their hands entwined. Moonlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in a gentle glow. Daniel whispered, "Do you realize? It all began with one small act. You shaved your head just so Ethan wouldn't feel alone. And from that moment, everything changed forever." Claire smiled, a tear shimmering at the corner of her eye. Sometimes, the smallest gesture can create an entire miracle. In that peaceful silence, Ethan stirred, eyes closed but mumbling softly. "Miss Claire, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor, but a good doctor, one who saves lots of kids." Daniel and Claire exchanged a glance, their hearts warmed. Claire bent down, kissed the boy's forehead, and whispered, "You can be anything you want to be, Ethan. Anything." And so, the story that began with a medical lie ended with a beautiful truth, that love and compassion can create miracles, not only saving one child, but changing the lives of many families forever.